At my youngest daughter's wedding, the groom threw a glass of champagne in my face and shouted, "Who invited you? This moment is only for special people." During the toast, my daughter asked for the microphone and revealed something that made him fall off his chair. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. I never imagined that the happiest day of my youngest daughter's life would become the most humiliating moment of mine. At 62 years old, I thought I had experienced enough of life's cruelties to be prepared for anything. I was wrong. The venue was everything Sarah had dreamed of since she was a little girl. The Riverside Country Club sparkled with white roses and twinkling lights, each table draped in cream silk that caught the afternoon sun streaming through the tall windows. I had helped pay for half of this wedding, though Sarah never acknowledged that fact to her fiancé Daniel. She said it would be easier if he didn't know about my contribution. I should have seen the warning signs then. I arrived early wearing my best navy suit, the one I had worn to Stephen's graduation from law school 3 years ago. My hands shook slightly as I adjusted my tie in the car mirror. It wasn't nerves about the ceremony itself, but rather the growing anxiety I had felt for months about Daniel's treatment of me. Every family dinner had become a minefield, every conversation a potential confrontation. Sarah had met Daniel 2 years ago at her marketing job. He was everything I wasn't: young, confident, from a wealthy family that owned several restaurants across the state. From our first meeting, I could see he looked down on me. I was just a retired high school principal who had worked 2 jobs to put his kids through college. To Daniel, I was beneath his notice. The ceremony itself went smoothly. Sarah looked radiant in her grandmother's vintage lace dress, the one my late wife Margaret had worn 35 years ago. For a moment, watching my daughter walk down the aisle, I forgot about Daniel's cold stares and dismissive comments. This was my baby girl, and despite everything, I was proud to be her father. The trouble started during the cocktail hour. I was standing near the bar, nursing a ginger ale and watching the guests mingle, when I overheard Daniel talking to his groomsmen. "I can't believe Sarah insisted on inviting him," Daniel said, his voice carrying more than he probably intended. "The guy's a nobody. My parents are wondering why we're letting family rejects sit at the main tables." One of his friends laughed. "Dude, it's her dad. You can't exactly uninvite him." "Trust me. After today, I won't have to deal with him much longer," Daniel replied, and something in his tone made my blood run cold. I moved away from the bar, my appetite completely gone. The rest of the cocktail hour passed in a blur of forced smiles and stilted conversations with relatives who seemed to echo Daniel's sentiment that I somehow didn't belong. When it came time for the reception, I found my assigned seat at table 8, far from the head table where Sarah and Daniel sat with their wedding party. Stephen was nowhere to be seen, having called that morning to say he couldn't make it due to a work emergency. I suspected the real reason was that he was avoiding another confrontation with Daniel, just as he had been avoiding family gatherings for the past year. The dinner was elegant, though I barely tasted the herb-crusted salmon or roasted vegetables. My stomach was tied in knots, and I kept glancing at the head table where Daniel held court, telling animated stories that had everyone laughing. Sarah hung on his every word, her face glowing with happiness that I hadn't seen since before her mother died. Then came the toasts. The best man spoke about friendship and loyalty. Sarah's maid of honor shared a tearful story about love conquering all. Daniel's father raised his glass to new beginnings and bright futures. Each speech felt like a subtle reminder that I was on the outside looking in. Finally, it was time for the traditional father of the bride toast. I had prepared my words carefully, practicing them in front of the bathroom mirror for weeks. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and raised my glass of champagne. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice slightly hoarse with emotion, "I want to thank you all for being here to celebrate Sarah and Daniel's—" Wait. Daniel's voice cut through the room like a knife. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The entire reception fell silent. "Who said you could give a toast?" I blinked, certain I had misheard. "I'm sorry?" Daniel walked toward me, his face flushed with what I initially thought was alcohol, but realized was pure anger. I said, "Who gave you permission to give a toast at my wedding?" "Daniel, he's my father." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, but she made no move to stand up or defend me. "Your father?" Daniel laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Sarah, we talked about this. This day is about our new life together, not about clinging to the past." I felt every eye in the room on me. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft clink of someone setting down their glass. My hands began to tremble, and I could feel sweat beading on my forehead despite the air conditioning. "I just wanted to say a few words about my daughter," I said quietly, hoping to defuse the situation. That's when Daniel grabbed the champagne glass from my hand and, in one swift motion, threw the contents directly into my face. The cold liquid hit me like a slap, soaking into my shirt and dripping onto my jacket. "Who invited you?" Daniel shouted, his voice echoing through the now completely silent ballroom. "This moment is for special people only, people who matter, people who belong in our new life." I stood there, champagne dripping from my face, my white shirt stained and my dignity shattered. Not a single person moved to help me. Not one guest spoke up in my defense. Even Sarah remained seated, her head turned away as if she couldn't bear to look at me. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Finally, I reached into my pocket for my handkerchief and wiped my face with as much dignity as I could muster. "I understand," I said quietly, though my voice cracked slightly. "I'll leave now." As I walked toward the exit, my shoes squelching slightly from the champagne that had splashed onto them, I heard Daniel address the room behind me. "I apologize for that unpleasant interruption," he said smoothly. Now, where were we? The conversations resumed, the laughter returned, and life went on as if I had never been there at all. As if the man who had raised Sarah, who had walked her to school every day for 6 years, who had sat by her bedside through pneumonia and heartbreaks and teenage rebellions, simply didn't exist. I drove home in my stained suit, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The humiliation burned worse than any physical pain I'd ever experienced. This wasn't just about Daniel's cruelty. It was about my daughter's silence, her unwillingness to defend the man who had given everything for her happiness. That night, I sat in my empty house, still in my ruined clothes, and wondered how I had become such a stranger to my own children. The humiliation at Sarah's wedding didn't happen overnight. Looking back now, I can see how Daniel systematically poisoned my daughter against me, one calculated move at a time. It started so subtly that I didn't recognize the pattern until it was too late. The first time I met Daniel, Sarah brought him to our traditional Sunday dinner. This was something we had done every week since Margaret died 4 years earlier. It was our way of staying connected, of honoring the family traditions my wife had cherished. Stephen would drive down from the city, Sarah would bring dessert, and we would spend the afternoon catching up over Margaret's famous pot roast recipe. Daniel arrived wearing a perfectly pressed button-down shirt and khakis that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in 6 months. He shook my hand with a grip that felt more like a test than a greeting, his eyes scanning my modest living room with barely concealed disdain. "This is where Sarah grew up," he said, his tone carefully neutral, but somehow managing to convey disappointment. "Cozy." I should have caught the condescension in that single word, but I was too focused on wanting to make a good impression on my daughter's new boyfriend. I showed him around the house, pointing out the family photos that lined the hallway, the certificate of appreciation I had received after 30 years of teaching, the small vegetable garden Margaret and I had planted together. "Teaching must be fulfilling," Daniel said when I mentioned my career. The pause before fulfilling was loaded with everything he didn't say about financial success and social status. During dinner, Daniel dominated the conversation, talking about his family's restaurant business, their vacation home in Aspen, his MBA from Northwestern. Every story seemed designed to highlight the differences between his world and mine. When Sarah asked about his parents, Daniel launched into a detailed description of their country club membership and their recent Mediterranean cruise. "What about you, Mr. Patterson?" Daniel asked, turning to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Any exciting travel plans? I had been saving up for a trip to Ireland, something Margaret and I had always dreamed of doing together. But sitting there, listening to Daniel casually mention $1,000 dinners and private ski instructors, my planned budget vacation suddenly felt pathetic. Nothing definite yet, I said, cutting another piece of roast. Dad's been wanting to visit Ireland, Sarah offered, and I felt a surge of gratitude for her support. Daniel nodded politely. Ireland's nice. We did a quick stop there last summer during our European tour. Pretty touristy, though. The really authentic experiences are hard to find unless you have the right connections. Just like that, my dream trip was reduced to something common and disappointing. Sarah's face fell slightly, and I saw her glance at Daniel with something that looked like embarrassment. That was the moment I should have spoken up, should have defended my modest dreams and honest work. Instead, I stayed silent. Over the following months, these small moments accumulated. Daniel would make offhand comments about upgrading Sarah's life, about showing her how the other half lives. He convinced her to move from her affordable apartment to a high-rise downtown, claiming it was more appropriate for someone in her position. When she worried about the rent increase, Daniel assured her it was an investment in her future. "Your dad wouldn't understand," he would say, whenever Sarah expressed concerns about the expenses. "He's from a different generation, with different priorities." Slowly, our Sunday dinners became less frequent. First, Daniel had family obligations that required Sarah's presence. Then, they started taking weekend trips to his parents' lake house. When we did manage to get together, Daniel would spend the entire time on his phone, fielding important business calls that couldn't wait until Monday. "Sorry, Mr. Patterson," he would say with false regret. "The restaurant business never sleeps. I'm sure you understand how demanding a career can be." The implication was clear. My teaching career hadn't been demanding at all, just a comfortable routine without real responsibility or pressure. Stephen saw through Daniel immediately. During one of our increasingly rare family gatherings, my son pulled me aside in the kitchen. "Dad, that guy is a manipulative piece of work," Stephen said, keeping his voice low. "Can't you see what he's doing to Sarah?" I wanted to agree, but I was terrified of pushing my daughter away entirely. "She seems happy," I said weakly. "She seems isolated," Stephen corrected. "When was the last time she called you without him being there? When was the last time you two had a conversation that didn't revolve around his opinions and preferences?" Stephen was right, but I didn't know how to fight an enemy I couldn't openly acknowledge. Daniel was too smart to be overtly cruel in front of Sarah. Instead, he used subtle digs and backhanded compliments that left me feeling foolish and small while appearing supportive to anyone watching. The breaking point with Stephen came 6 months before the wedding. We were all at dinner when Daniel started talking about his plans to modernize Sarah's career prospects. "Sarah's been wasting her potential in that little marketing firm," Daniel announced. "My father has connections at a real agency downtown. Sarah could be making twice her current salary within a year." "I like my job," Sarah protested mildly. "Of course you do, sweetheart," Daniel said, patting her hand. "But you have to think bigger. Your family never taught you to think about real success, did they?" Stephen's fork clattered against his plate. "Excuse me?" Daniel turned to my son with that same condescending smile. "I just mean that Sarah has been held back by limited expectations. Her family did their best with what they had, but she deserves more than settling for comfortable mediocrity." "Our father put 2 kids through college on a teacher's salary," Stephen said, his voice dangerously quiet. "He worked summers painting houses and weekends tutoring just to make sure we never went without. Don't you dare suggest he didn't teach us about success." Daniel held up his hands in mock surrender. "I didn't mean any offense. I respect blue-collar work ethic. It's just a different approach to life. Blue-collar." As if teaching high school English and helping teenagers discover their potential was somehow beneath notice. As if the 20-hour days I worked during Sarah's senior year, tutoring other people's children to afford her college textbooks, was just getting by. Stephen left that night and didn't come back. Over the next few months, Daniel made sure to mention my son's absence at every opportunity. "It's too bad Stephen can't seem to make time for family," he would say with false concern. "Sarah deserves better from her brother. Family should be there for the important moments." The terrible irony was that Daniel was using my own values against me. I had raised my children to prioritize family, to show up for each other, to put relationships before career advancement. Now Daniel was twisting those teachings, making Stephen's absence seem like a character flaw while positioning himself as the devoted partner who truly cared about Sarah's happiness. By the time Daniel proposed, I had been effectively erased from my daughter's daily life. Sarah would call occasionally, but the conversations felt scripted and distant. She would ask about my health and the weather, share carefully edited updates about her job and their relationship, and then end the call after exactly 15 minutes. The engagement party was held at Daniel's parents' country club. I received an invitation, but when I arrived, I discovered my name wasn't on the guest list. Daniel apologized profusely in front of the other guests, claiming it was a miscommunication with the caterers. "Don't worry, Mr. Patterson," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "We'll make sure there's a spot for you. Family's family, right?" He made it sound like he was doing me a favor, like my presence was an act of charity rather than a right. Sarah smiled gratefully at her fiancé, thanking him for being so understanding and flexible about the mistake. I spent that evening sitting alone at a hastily arranged table near the kitchen, watching my daughter celebrate her future with a man who saw me as nothing more than an inconvenient reminder of her humble beginnings. Now, driving home from the wedding with champagne stains on my shirt and the echo of Daniel's words ringing in my ears, I finally understood the full scope of what had happened. This wasn't just about a young man's arrogance or social climbing. This was about erasing me completely, about rewriting Sarah's history to exclude everything that didn't fit Daniel's vision of who she should be. But as I pulled into my driveway and sat in the darkened car, one thought kept circling through my mind. Daniel had made one crucial mistake in his campaign to eliminate me from Sarah's life. He had assumed I would simply fade away, accepting my exile with the same quiet dignity I had shown for the past 2 years. He was about to learn that a lifetime of teaching had taught me more than just English literature. It had taught me patience, strategy, and the importance of waiting for exactly the right moment to make your point. The months following Sarah's wedding were the loneliest of my life. The house that had once been filled with laughter and family dinners now echoed with nothing but the sound of my own footsteps and the ticking of Margaret's grandfather clock in the hallway. I had thought losing my wife was the deepest grief I would ever experience, but at least then I had my children to lean on. Now I understood what true isolation felt like. Sarah called exactly once after the wedding, 3 days later. Her voice was bright and artificial, like someone reading from a script. "Hi, Dad. Just wanted to thank you for coming to the wedding. Daniel and I are having such a wonderful time in Tuscany. The weather is perfect and the food is incredible. Daniel's parents recommended this amazing little vineyard that most tourists never find." I waited for her to mention what had happened, to acknowledge the humiliation I had endured, to offer some explanation or apology. Instead, she chatted about olive oil tastings and Renaissance art for exactly 12 minutes before saying she had to go. "Daniel's calling for me," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "We're meeting his college friends for dinner at this exclusive restaurant." "Love you, Dad. I'll call soon." She didn't call soon. She didn't call at all. I tried reaching out myself, sending text messages that went unanswered, and leaving voicemails that were never returned. After 2 weeks of silence, I drove to her apartment building and asked the doorman to ring her unit. He came back shaking his head. "I'm sorry, sir. Ms. Patterson says she's not available for visitors today." Ms. Patterson. She had moved in with Daniel after the wedding, but was apparently keeping her maiden name for the lease. The doorman's sympathetic expression told me this wasn't the first time he had delivered this message to someone trying to reach her. Stephen was equally unreachable, though for different reasons. When I finally got him on the phone, his voice was cold and distant. "Dad, I warned you about Daniel. I tried to tell you what was happening, but you chose to play nice instead of protecting yourself or Sarah. I can't watch you get destroyed piece by piece." "She's still your sister," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "No, Dad, she's Daniel's wife now, and apparently that means she's not our family anymore. I won't subject myself to that kind of treatment, and honestly, I'm surprised you're still trying." The line went dead, and when I called back, Stephen's phone went straight to voicemail. I left message after message, but he never responded. It was as if both of my children had simply decided I no longer existed. The worst part was the way other people began treating me. Margaret's sister, Carol, who had been like a second mother to Sarah and Stephen, stopped returning my calls. When I ran into her at the grocery store, she gave me a tight smile and hurried away after 30 seconds of awkward small talk. "How are the kids?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation going. "Oh, you know," Carol said vaguely, her eyes darting toward the exit. "Busy with their own lives. Young people today. Always so much going on." But I knew she had seen Sarah just the week before, had even posted photos on Facebook of a lunch they had shared. Sarah was laughing in the pictures, looking radiant and happy, her arm around her aunt. The caption read, "So blessed to have family who truly understand what matters in life." The message was clear. I was no longer part of the family that mattered. My neighbor Tom, who had known Sarah since she was 5 years old, mentioned seeing her at the upscale shopping district downtown. "She looked great," he said, but there was something careful in his tone. Really put together. Expensive clothes, fancy car. That husband of hers seems to be taking good care of her. Did she ask about me? I couldn't help asking. Tom's expression grew uncomfortable. "Well, you know how it is. People get busy with their new lives. I'm sure she thinks about you all the time." But his eyes said otherwise. His eyes said that Sarah had walked right past him without acknowledgement, too absorbed in her phone conversation with Daniel to notice the man who used to give her quarters for the ice cream truck. I began to understand that Daniel's campaign against me hadn't ended with the wedding. If anything, it had intensified. He was systematically erasing me from every corner of Sarah's world, replacing her old relationships with new ones that revolved entirely around his social circle and family connections. I learned this firsthand when I decided to visit Sarah's workplace. I had helped her practice for the interview at that marketing firm 3 years ago, had celebrated with her when she got the promotion to senior account coordinator. Surely her colleagues would be more neutral ground. The receptionist recognized me immediately. "Mr. Patterson, it's so nice to see you. Are you here to see Sarah?" "Is she available?" I asked hopefully. The young woman's face fell. "Oh, I'm sorry. Sarah doesn't work here anymore. She left about a month ago, didn't she tell you?" A month ago. Sarah had quit her job a month ago and hadn't mentioned it during our brief post-wedding phone call. I felt the familiar sting of exclusion, but forced myself to smile. Of course she did. "I'm just getting old and forgetful. Do you know where she's working now?" "She's at Preston and Associates downtown. It's this really prestigious agency. Her husband's father helped her get the position. She seemed really excited about the opportunity to work with more high-profile clients." Preston and Associates. I had heard of them. They handled marketing for luxury hotels and high-end restaurants, exactly the kind of business that would appeal to Daniel's sense of status and importance. Sarah had loved her old job specifically because it focused on community organizations and local businesses, causes she cared about rather than just profit margins. I drove to Preston and Associates, a gleaming glass tower in the financial district. The lobby was all marble and modern art, intimidatingly expensive. When I asked for Sarah Patterson, the security guard made me wait while he called upstairs. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, after a hushed conversation. "Ms. Patterson is in meetings all afternoon and won't be able to see visitors." Through the glass walls I could see people coming and going from the elevators, but none of them was my daughter. I waited for 2 hours, hoping to catch a glimpse of her during a break or lunch hour. Finally, a woman in an expensive suit approached me. "Excuse me, are you Mr. Patterson?" she asked, her voice professionally polite but firm. "I'm Jennifer Walsh, Sarah's supervisor. Sarah asked me to let you know that she's extremely busy with a major client presentation and won't be available today. She suggested you call her office to schedule an appointment if you need to discuss something important." An appointment. To see my own daughter, I needed to schedule an appointment through her supervisor. The humiliation was so complete that I could barely form words to respond. "Please tell her I stopped by," I managed to say. "Of course," Jennifer said, but her expression suggested she had no intention of delivering any such message. That evening, I sat in my living room, surrounded by photo albums and memories of the family I had apparently lost. Pictures of Sarah's high school graduation, where she had hugged me so tightly I thought she might never let go. Images of Stephen's college sends-off, where he had whispered, "Thank you for everything," in my ear before boarding the plane. Christmas mornings, birthday parties, family vacations to the lake, where we had rented the same cabin for 15 consecutive years. In every photo, we looked happy. We looked like people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company, who chose to spend time together because we wanted to, not because we had to. I stared at those images and wondered when everything had changed, when love had become conditional on social status and financial success. My phone rang once during those long evening hours. For a moment, my heart leaped, thinking it might be Sarah or Stephen. Instead, it was Daniel's mother, Catherine. "Mark," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I wanted to check on you after the wedding. I hope you understand that Daniel was just overwhelmed by the emotion of the day. You know how passionate young men can be about protecting their brides." "He threw champagne in my face," I said, quietly. "Well, yes, that was unfortunate, but you have to understand, Mark, this is a very delicate time for Sarah and Daniel. They're building a new life together, and sometimes that means making difficult choices about which relationships to prioritize." The careful phrasing told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't an apology or an attempt at reconciliation. This was a warning, delivered with the kind of polite cruelty that wealthy people had perfected over generations. "Sarah is thriving in her new environment," Catherine continued. "Daniel's father has introduced her to some very influential people in the marketing world. She's already making connections that could transform her entire career trajectory. I'm sure you want what's best for your daughter, even if that means stepping back and giving her space to grow." "I am what's best for her," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "I'm her father." Catherine's laugh was like ice crystals. "Oh, Mark, being a biological parent doesn't automatically make someone beneficial to a child's future. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is recognize when they've served their purpose and gracefully exit the stage." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at the phone and finally understanding the full scope of what I was up against. This wasn't just about Daniel's personal dislike of me. This was about an entire social class that saw people like me as obstacles to be removed, inconvenient reminders of a past that didn't fit their carefully curated image of success and sophistication. But as I sat there in the growing darkness, something inside me began to shift. The grief and confusion I had been feeling slowly crystallized into something sharper and more focused. They thought they could erase me, could rewrite Sarah's history to exclude the man who had raised her with love and sacrifice. They were counting on my quiet dignity, my reluctance to cause a scene or fight back. They had made one crucial miscalculation. They assumed that because I was a teacher, because I lived modestly and spoke softly, I was weak. They had no idea that I had spent 30 years dealing with bullies, manipulators, and entitled teenagers who thought they could intimidate their way out of consequences. I had been patient long enough. It was time to remind them all that underestimating a dedicated father was a very dangerous mistake. The decision to investigate Daniel didn't come from a place of revenge, at least not initially. It came from the growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with a man who could orchestrate such a complete destruction of family relationships. In my 30 years of teaching, I had encountered enough manipulative personalities to recognize the patterns, and Daniel's behavior went far beyond normal social climbing or family tension. I started small with the kind of basic research that any concerned father might do. I looked up Daniel's family business online, read through their restaurant reviews, checked out their social media presence. What I found was impressive on the surface, but oddly inconsistent when I looked more closely. The Riverside Restaurant Group claimed to own 7 establishments across 3 states, with Daniel listed as Director of Operations on their corporate website. The photos showed elegant dining rooms and carefully plated dishes, the kind of upscale establishments that charged $50 for an entree. But when I called several of the locations during business hours, I got disconnected numbers or recordings saying the restaurants were temporarily closed for renovations. This struck me as odd for a supposedly thriving business empire. I drove to 2 of the local addresses listed on their website and found empty storefronts with "for lease" signs in the windows. The properties had clearly been vacant for months, if not years. My curiosity piqued. I decided to dig deeper. I had learned basic internet research skills during my years of helping students with college applications and scholarship searches. It was surprising how much information was available if you knew where to look and had the patience to piece together fragments from different sources. Daniel's LinkedIn profile was polished and professional, listing his MBA from Northwestern and his current position with the family business. But when I searched for his name in Northwestern's alumni directory, I found no record of a Daniel Morrison graduating from their business school in the time frame he claimed. I double-checked by calling the registrar's office, pretending to be a potential employer, verifying education credentials. "I'm sorry, sir," the registrar said after checking their records. "We have no record of a Daniel Morrison completing an MBA program here in the past 10 years. The first concrete lie. I felt a mixture of vindication and growing alarm. If Daniel was lying about his education, what else was fabricated? I spent the next several weeks systematically fact-checking every claim Daniel had made about his background. The Mediterranean cruise with his parents never happened, according to the travel blog Catherine Morrison maintained religiously. The family's supposed vacation home in Aspen was actually a timeshare they used for 1 week each winter, not the year-round retreat Daniel had described. Most tellingly, the important business calls he constantly took during family dinners were often to voicemail services or disconnected numbers. But it was the financial records that revealed the most disturbing truth. Using the property records database at the county courthouse, I discovered that Catherine and Richard Morrison's house was in foreclosure proceedings. Their primary restaurant, the flagship location they claimed was their most successful, had been closed by the health department 6 months earlier for multiple violations. Daniel's family wasn't wealthy. They were drowning in debt and using elaborate lies to maintain the appearance of success, which meant that Daniel's pursuit of Sarah wasn't about love or compatibility. It was about finding someone with enough earning potential and family stability to serve as a financial lifeline. The pieces of the puzzle began clicking together with sickening clarity. Sarah's sudden job change wasn't about career advancement. It was about access to higher-paying clients and networking opportunities that Daniel needed for his own schemes. Her isolation from our family wasn't about social climbing. It was about preventing anyone from asking inconvenient questions about her new husband's background. I had been so focused on the emotional manipulation that I had missed the financial angle entirely. Daniel hadn't just stolen my daughter's affection. He was systematically positioning himself to exploit her professional connections and earning potential. But I needed more than just suspicions and circumstantial evidence. If I was going to confront this situation, I needed facts that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. That's when I decided to do something I had never imagined myself capable of. I hired a private investigator. Janet Reeves came recommended by a colleague whose daughter had gone through a difficult divorce. Janet was a former police detective who specialized in background investigations and fraud cases. She was professional, discreet, and expensive, but she agreed to look into Daniel's history for a flat fee that would require me to dip into my retirement savings. "What exactly are you hoping to find?" Janet asked during our initial meeting at a coffee shop near her office. "The truth," I said simply. "My daughter married a man who has systematically isolated her from her family and seems to be lying about his background. I need to know who he really is and what his intentions are." Janet nodded, making notes in her leather portfolio. I'll need some basic information to get started. Full name, date of birth, social security number if you have it, known addresses, and employment history. I provided what I could from the wedding invitations and the few conversations I had overheard. Janet promised to have preliminary findings within 2 weeks. The wait was excruciating. Every day that passed was another day of Sarah being drawn deeper into Daniel's web of lies. I found myself checking my phone constantly, hoping for some word from the investigator, or even better, an unexpected call from my daughter. Neither came. Instead, I received a visit that changed everything. I was grading papers at my kitchen table on a Thursday evening when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a young woman I didn't recognize, probably in her mid-20s with short dark hair and nervous eyes. "Mr. Patterson," she said when I opened the door, "my name is Jessica Chen. I think we need to talk about Daniel Morrison." I invited her in, my heart racing with possibilities. Jessica perched on the edge of my sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I saw your daughter's wedding announcement in the paper," she said without preamble. "I almost called then, but I wasn't sure. Maybe he had changed, but then I heard about what happened at the reception, and I realized I couldn't stay quiet anymore." "What do you know about Daniel?" I asked, settling into my chair across from her. Jessica took a shaky breath. "I was engaged to him 2 years ago. For 8 months, until I discovered that everything he had told me about himself was a lie." The story that poured out of Jessica over the next hour was a horrifying mirror of what Daniel had done to Sarah. He had pursued Jessica aggressively, showering her with attention and expensive gifts he couldn't afford. He had isolated her from her friends and family by claiming they didn't understand their special connection. He had convinced her to move in with him and take on more financial responsibility while he pursued business opportunities that never materialized. He told me his family was wealthy, that he was going to inherit the restaurant business, Jessica said, her voice bitter with memory. He convinced me to co-sign a loan for $50,000, claiming it was a temporary cash flow issue, while his trust fund was being transferred. The money disappeared into his personal accounts, and I was left responsible for the debt. What happened when you confronted him? He disappeared, literally. One day he was there, the next day all his belongings were gone, and his phone number was disconnected. I found out later that he had moved to another city and was already pursuing someone else. Jessica's eyes filled with tears. It took me 18 months to pay off that loan. I had to move back in with my parents and take a second job. I felt sick. Did you try to press charges? I consulted with a lawyer, but it's complicated when you voluntarily sign the loan documents. Technically, Daniel didn't commit fraud. He just lied about his intentions. Unless I could prove he never intended to pay the money back, there wasn't much legal recourse. Jessica reached into her purse and pulled out a thick manila folder. But I kept everything: bank records, text messages, emails, photos. I documented every lie he told me, every promise he broke. I kept thinking someday I might need this information. She handed me the folder, and I opened it with trembling hands. Inside were copies of loan documents with Jessica's signature alongside Daniel's, bank statements showing large withdrawals from accounts in both their names, and a series of increasingly desperate text messages from Jessica asking Daniel to explain where the money had gone. But the most damning evidence was a collection of photographs Jessica had taken of documents she found in Daniel's apartment. Business cards for multiple identities, fake references for job applications, and a handwritten list of what appeared to be potential targets: young professional women with good credit scores and family money. Sarah's name was on that list. "There are others," Jessica said quietly. "I've been in touch with 2 other women who had similar experiences with Daniel. One lost $30,000. The other had her credit destroyed when Daniel took out credit cards in her name. We've been trying to figure out how to stop him, but he's always careful to stay just within the boundaries of what's technically legal." I stared at the photographs, my hands shaking with rage and fear. My daughter hadn't just married a liar and a manipulator. She had married a predator who had systematically targeted her for financial exploitation. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. Jessica leaned forward, her expression intense. "Because Sarah is different from the rest of us. We were all isolated, vulnerable women without strong family connections. But Sarah has you, and she has her brother. Even though Daniel has driven a wedge between you, that foundation is still there. If anyone can reach her before it's too late, it's her family. What makes you think it's not already too late? Because Daniel's getting desperate, Jessica said. His parents' business is failing, and his usual con games aren't working anymore. I've been monitoring his social media, and he's already pushing Sarah into higher profile events and networking opportunities. He's moving faster than usual, which means he's planning something big. I closed the folder, my mind racing. I had the evidence I needed to expose Daniel, but Jessica was right about the legal complications. Even if I could prove his pattern of fraud, it might not be enough to protect Sarah from financial ruin or emotional devastation. There's something else, Jessica said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Daniel has a violent temper when his plans are threatened. When I confronted him about the missing money, he hit me, hard enough to leave bruises. I was too scared and embarrassed to report it, but I took photos. The final piece clicked into place. Daniel wasn't just a financial predator. He was potentially dangerous. If I exposed him publicly or tried to force a confrontation, Sarah could be at risk of more than just financial loss. I walked Jessica to the door, promising to stay in touch and thanking her for her courage in coming forward. After she left, I sat in my living room holding the folder of evidence and facing the most difficult decision of my life. I could take this information directly to Sarah, but Daniel had spent 2 years poisoning her against me. She would likely dismiss anything I said as jealousy or vindictiveness. I could go to the police, but as Jessica had explained, most of Daniel's actions fell into legal gray areas that would be difficult to prosecute. Or I could wait, watch, and prepare for the right moment to act. The moment when Daniel's mask finally slipped completely, and Sarah would be ready to see the truth about the man she had married. The private investigator's report arrived 3 days later, confirming everything Jessica had told me, and adding new details that made my blood run cold. Daniel had been operating this same con for at least 5 years, targeting successful women in different cities and leaving a trail of financial and emotional destruction behind him. But Janet had also discovered something else. Daniel was already setting up Sarah for his biggest score yet. He had convinced her to apply for a business loan using her new job's income projections, ostensibly to help him expand the family restaurant business. The loan was for $200,000, more than enough to destroy Sarah financially if Daniel disappeared with the money. I stared at the investigator's report, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. My daughter was in more danger than she could possibly imagine, and I was the only person who knew the full scope of Daniel's deception. The question was no longer whether to act, but how to act, without putting Sarah at even greater risk. Because now I understood that this wasn't just about getting my daughter back. It was about saving her from a predator who had already destroyed multiple lives and was preparing to destroy hers next. The opportunity I had been waiting for came in the most unexpected way possible. Stephen called me on a Tuesday morning, his voice tight with worry, and something else I hadn't heard from him in months. Respect. Dad, I need to see you tonight. It's about Sarah. We met at a diner halfway between his apartment and my house, a neutral location that felt appropriate for what I suspected would be a difficult conversation. Stephen looked exhausted, his usually immaculate appearance rumpled and strained. She called me last night, he said without preamble, sliding into the booth across from me. First time in 8 months. She was crying, Dad, really crying, not the fake emotional manipulation stuff Daniel does. My heart clenched. What happened? Daniel hit her. The words came out flat and cold, but I could see the rage burning in Stephen's eyes. She tried to downplay it, said it was just stress from work and that she probably overreacted. But I know Sarah, and I know the difference between her being dramatic and her being genuinely scared. I felt that familiar surge of protective fury, the same feeling I had experienced when Sarah was 12 and came home with a black eye from a school bully. But this time, the threat was much more dangerous and much closer to home. Did she say what triggered it? Stephen rubbed his temples, looking older than his 29 years. She questioned some financial documents he wanted her to sign, something about a business loan. Daniel told her she was being paranoid and untrusting, and when she pressed for more details, he exploded. The business loan? I felt my stomach drop as I remembered Janet's report about the $200,000 loan application. Daniel was moving forward with his plan, and Sarah was finally starting to ask the right questions. "Stephen," I said carefully, "there are things about Daniel that you don't know, things I've discovered that Sarah needs to hear." I had debated whether to involve Stephen in my investigation, worried that he would dismiss my findings as the desperate attempts of a rejected father to win back his daughter's attention. But now, with Sarah reaching out to him in fear, I realized I needed an ally who could approach her without the baggage of our strained relationship. Over the next hour, I shared everything with Stephen: Jessica's story, the private investigator's findings, the pattern of fraud and manipulation that had destroyed multiple women's lives. I showed him the photographs, the bank records, the evidence of Daniel's systematic deception. Stephen's expression grew darker with each revelation. "Jesus Christ, Dad? How long have you known about this?" 2 months, I admitted. "I've been trying to figure out how to approach Sarah without making things worse. Every time I've tried to reach out, Daniel has made sure I was blocked or dismissed." "And you didn't think to tell me?" I met his gaze steadily. "You made it clear you wanted nothing to do with this family drama. I was trying to protect you from having to choose sides." Stephen was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the evidence spread across the diner table. When he looked up, his expression had shifted from anger to something that looked like regret. "I've been an idiot," he said quietly. "I was so angry about what Daniel was doing to you and Sarah that I just walked away. I told myself I was protecting my own sanity, but really, I was just being a coward." "You were protecting yourself," I corrected. "That's not cowardice, that's survival." "No, Dad. What you've been doing, that's survival. Gathering evidence, staying patient, waiting for the right moment to help Sarah even after she treated you like garbage at her own wedding. I should have stood by you instead of running away." The reconciliation I had hoped for with my son was happening, but under circumstances I wouldn't have wished on anyone. Still, having Stephen back on my side felt like a weight lifting from my shoulders. "The question is," Stephen said, organizing the papers into a neat stack, "how do we approach Sarah without spooking Daniel into doing something drastic?" "We don't approach her," I said. "She approaches us. You said she called you when she was scared. That means part of her is already questioning what Daniel has told her about cutting ties with family. We need to be ready for when she reaches out again." "And if she doesn't?" I pulled out my phone and showed Stephen a text message I had received that morning from Janet, the private investigator. "Daniel's parents' house went into foreclosure yesterday. The bank is seizing their assets tomorrow. According to my source at the loan office, Daniel has been telling creditors that his new wife has significant family wealth that will cover their debts." Stephen's face went pale. "He's planning to disappear with the loan money and leave Sarah holding the bag." "Worse than that," I said. "If he's following his usual pattern, he'll drain her accounts and max out her credit cards before he goes. Sarah could lose everything: her job, her savings, her credit rating, maybe even face criminal charges if the loan application contains false information." "When?" "Soon. Jessica thinks Daniel is getting desperate because his usual timeline isn't working. Sarah is asking too many questions, and his parents' financial collapse means he's running out of time to maintain his cover story." Stephen leaned back in the booth, processing the implications. "So we wait for Sarah to call again, and when she does, we're ready with proof that can't be dismissed or explained away." "Exactly. But Stephen, when that moment comes, you have to be the one to present the evidence. If it comes from me, Daniel will convince her it's just a jealous father trying to destroy her marriage. Coming from you, it might have a chance." That chance came sooner than either of us expected. Stephen called me at 11 o'clock that same night. "She's here," he said without preamble. "At my apartment. She's got a bruise on her cheek and she's asking questions about the loan paperwork. Can you come over?" I was dressed and in my car within 5 minutes. The drive to Stephen's apartment felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. This was it, the moment when everything would either come together or fall apart completely. Sarah was sitting on Stephen's couch when I arrived, wrapped in one of his old college sweatshirts. her face puffy from crying. The bruise on her left cheek was dark purple and impossible to ignore. When she saw me, her expression flickered between relief and something that might have been shame. "Dad," she said quietly, and it was the first time she had called me that since before the engagement. I sat down carefully in the chair across from her, fighting every instinct to rush over and pull her into a protective hug. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" "Confused," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And scared. Daniel's been acting strange lately, secretive. And today when I asked about the loan documents, he just exploded. He's never hit me before, Dad. He said it was my fault for not trusting him. But I don't understand why asking questions makes me untrustworthy." Stephen sat down beside her, his expression gentle but serious. "Sarah, Dad has some information about Daniel that you need to see. It's not going to be easy to hear, but you deserve to know the truth." Sarah's eyes darted between us, and I could see the internal struggle playing out on her face. 2 years of Daniel's conditioning telling her that her family was jealous and manipulative, warring against her own growing instincts that something was very wrong. "What kind of information?" she asked. I opened the folder I had brought and carefully removed the least damaging documents first. Daniel's education credentials are false. He never attended Northwestern. His family's business is in bankruptcy. The restaurants he claims to own have been closed for months. Sarah stared at the papers, her hands trembling slightly. These could be fake. Anyone can create documents like this. "You're right," I said calmly. "That's why I hired a private investigator to verify everything. But there's more, sweetheart. Things that explain why Daniel has been so determined to isolate you from your family." I told her about Jessica, about the pattern of financial fraud, about the other women whose lives Daniel had destroyed. With each revelation, Sarah's face grew paler, but she didn't interrupt or deny what she was hearing. Finally, I showed her the photographs of Daniel's handwritten target list with her name on it. "This was taken 8 months before he first approached you at work," I said gently. "He didn't fall in love with you, Sarah. He selected you." Sarah stared at the photograph for a long time, her breathing shallow and rapid. When she finally looked up, tears were streaming down her face. "The loan," she whispered. "He said it was to expand his parents' business, but the paperwork, it all goes into accounts that only he can access." $200,000, Stephen confirmed, which matches the amount he stole from his previous target. Sarah doubled over as if she had been punched, her hands covering her face. Oh God, I'm so stupid. How could I be so stupid?" I couldn't hold back anymore. I moved to the couch and pulled my daughter into my arms, feeling her sob against my shoulder the way she had when she was a little girl with a scraped knee. "You're not stupid," I said firmly. "You're a victim of a very sophisticated predator who has had years to perfect his methods. None of this is your fault." "But I chose him over you," she cried. "I let him turn me against my own family. I was horrible to you at the wedding, and you didn't deserve any of it." "Boy, that's what manipulators do," Stephen said, his voice thick with emotion. "They isolate their victims from anyone who might see through their lies. Daniel knew that Dad and I would eventually figure out what he was doing, so he made sure you wouldn't trust us when we tried to warn you." Sarah pulled back to look at me, her eyes red and swollen. "What do I do now? If he finds out that I know, if he realizes I'm questioning everything—" "Sure, he won't find out," I said with more confidence than I felt. "We're going to be very careful about how we handle this. The most important thing right now is your safety." "I can't go back there tonight," Sarah said, panic creeping into her voice. "He was drinking when I left, and he gets mean when he drinks. What if he realizes I'm not coming home?" Stephen stood up, his jaw set with determination. "Then you don't go home. You stay here tonight, and tomorrow we figure out how to get you away from him safely. But my things, my job, the apartment lease—" "We'll handle all of that," I assured her. "One step at a time. The most important thing is that you're safe, and that Daniel doesn't have a chance to hurt you again or disappear with your money." Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of Stephen's sweatshirt. "I need to call the bank tomorrow and put a hold on the loan application." "That first thing in the morning," I agreed. "And then we're going to make sure Daniel Morrison never has the opportunity to hurt another woman the way he's hurt you." For the first time in months, Sarah looked directly at me with something that resembled trust. Dad, I'm so sorry for everything, for the wedding, for shutting you out, for choosing him over my own family. You have nothing to apologize for, I said, meaning every word. You were manipulated by an expert. All that matters now is that you're safe and that we're together again. Sarah leaned against me, and I felt something that had been broken inside my chest begin to heal. We weren't out of danger yet. Daniel would realize soon that his carefully constructed world was crumbling. But my daughter was back in my arms, and this time I wasn't going to let anyone take her away from me again. The next morning brought a flurry of activity that felt both liberating and terrifying. Sarah called her bank as soon as they opened, putting an immediate hold on the loan application and requesting a meeting with a manager to discuss potential fraud concerns. Stephen took a personal day from work to help coordinate Sarah's escape from the life Daniel had built around her. And I found myself in the unfamiliar position of being not just welcome in my daughter's crisis, but essential to solving it. Daniel called Sarah's phone 17 times before noon. We let every call go to voicemail, listening to his messages grow progressively more frantic and threatening. Sarah, where are you? You better not be talking to your father about private family business. Sarah, I'm starting to get worried. Call me back immediately. Sarah, I know you're with your brother. This is exactly the kind of family manipulation I've been trying to protect you from. And finally, Sarah, if you think you can humiliate me by running to your family with lies, you're going to regret it. I made you who you are, and I can destroy everything you've built just as easily. That last message sealed our decision to involve the police. I had been hesitant to take legal action without more concrete evidence of criminal behavior, but threatening voice messages combined with documented domestic violence gave us grounds for at least a restraining order. Detective Maria Santos listened carefully as we laid out Daniel's pattern of fraud and manipulation. She was professional but clearly skeptical until we produced Jessica's documentation and the private investigator's report. This is impressive work, she admitted, flipping through the evidence. But most of what you've shown me falls into civil rather than criminal territory. The domestic violence incident gives us grounds for a restraining order, but fraud cases require proof of criminal intent, which is notoriously difficult to establish. What about the fake identity documents? Stephen asked, pointing to the photographs Jessica had taken. If we can locate the originals and prove he used them to obtain employment or credit, that could be identity fraud, but photographs aren't enough for criminal charges. Sarah had been quiet during most of the police interview, but now she spoke up. Detective Santos, what if I could get him to admit to the fraud? If I recorded him talking about taking money from previous girlfriends or lying about his background? That would be extremely dangerous, Detective Santos said immediately. And depending on how it's done, potentially inadmissible in court. I can't officially recommend that approach. Oh, but her tone suggested she wasn't entirely opposed to the idea, and I could see Sarah's mind working. My daughter had inherited my stubbornness and, apparently, my sense of justice. He's expecting me to come crawling back, Sarah said slowly. He thinks he's broken me down enough that I'll accept his excuses and apologize for questioning him. What if I played into that expectation? Absolutely not, I said immediately. Sarah, this man has already hit you once. If he realizes you're gathering evidence against him, there's no telling what he might do. Dad's right, Stephen agreed. It's too risky. But Sarah had that determined expression I remembered from her teenage years, the same look she had gotten when she decided to run for student body president, despite being told she was too young, or when she insisted on taking advanced calculus despite her guidance counselor's doubts. He's going to disappear soon anyway, she said. Once he realizes the loan isn't going through and that I'm not coming home, he'll cut his losses and move on to his next target. This might be our only chance to get evidence that could protect other women. Detective Santos studied Sarah carefully. If you were determined to have such a conversation, hypothetically speaking, it would need to be in a public place with backup nearby, and you would need to be very careful about how you directed the conversation to avoid entrapment issues. That afternoon, Sarah called Daniel from Stephen's apartment. I sat beside her, my heart pounding, as I listened to her side of the conversation. "Daniel, I'm sorry about last night. I think I overreacted because of work stress. Can we meet for coffee and talk things through?" Daniel's relief was audible even from where I sat. "Of course, sweetheart. I was so worried about you. Your family has been poisoning your mind against me, haven't they?" "Maybe a little," Sarah said, her voice perfectly calibrated to sound apologetic but not defeated. "I just need to understand some things about our finances so I can feel secure moving forward." They arranged to meet at a busy cafe downtown, a location Sarah chose because it had small, intimate tables that would seem romantic to Daniel while actually making it easier for recording devices to pick up conversation. Stephen and I would be at a table across the restaurant, close enough to intervene if needed, but far enough away to avoid detection. 2 hours later, I watched my daughter walk into that cafe wearing a wire provided by Detective Santos and carrying the weight of not just her own future, but potentially the futures of other women Daniel might target. I had never been more proud of her or more terrified for her safety. Daniel was already waiting at a corner table, and his face lit up when he saw Sarah approach. From my vantage point, I could see him stand and pull out her chair, playing the role of the devoted husband seeking reconciliation. But I could also see the tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes constantly scanned the restaurant, looking for threats or witnesses. Sarah settled into her chair and began the performance of her life. Even from across the room, I could tell she was nervous, but she channeled that energy into the character of a confused wife seeking reassurance from her husband. I couldn't hear their conversation from my table, but I could see Daniel's body language shift as Sarah asked her carefully prepared questions. His initial relief gave way to irritation, then to something that looked like panic as Sarah pressed for specific details about his family's business and his previous relationships. The critical moment came about 20 minutes into their conversation. I saw Daniel lean forward aggressively, his hand reaching across the table to grab Sarah's wrist. She pulled back slightly, but didn't flee, maintaining her cover even as his grip tightened enough to leave marks. That's when Stephen and I stood up simultaneously, moving toward their table with Detective Santos close behind. Daniel saw us coming and released Sarah's wrist, his face cycling through confusion, rage, and finally a cold calculation that made my blood run cold. "Well," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the now quiet cafe, "the whole family's here for the intervention. How touching." "Daniel Morrison," Detective Santos said, stepping forward with her badge visible. "You're under arrest for domestic violence and harassment. You have the right to remain silent." Daniel's mask finally slipped completely. The charming, confident businessman disappeared, replaced by someone whose eyes held a barely contained violence that explained why his previous victims had been too terrified to fight back. "You think you're so smart," he snarled at Sarah, as the handcuffs clicked into place. "But you're nothing without me. You'll never find anyone else who's willing to put up with your family's dysfunction and your pathetic need for approval." "You'd actually," Sarah said, standing up and straightening her shoulders, "I think I'll be just fine." The recording Sarah had made provided enough evidence for fraud charges against Daniel and led to a broader investigation that uncovered his activities across multiple states. Jessica and the other victims finally had their voices heard, and Daniel's pattern of predatory behavior was exposed in court proceedings that made local headlines. But the real victory wasn't in Daniel's eventual conviction or the restitution that was ordered for his victims. The real victory was what happened in the months that followed. Sarah moved back home while she rebuilt her life, sleeping in her childhood bedroom and gradually healing from the psychological damage Daniel had inflicted. We talked for hours, sometimes about the trauma she had endured, but more often about ordinary things. Her work, my retirement plans, memories of her mother that we could finally share without the shadow of Daniel's manipulation hanging over us. Stephen became a regular fixture at our Sunday dinners again, and slowly, carefully, we rebuilt the family traditions that Daniel had systematically destroyed. Sarah started therapy to process the abuse and learned to recognize the warning signs of manipulation. I started therapy too, working through my own guilt about not acting sooner and learning how to support Sarah without becoming overprotective. The divorce proceedings were swift and decisive. Daniel had no legitimate claim to any of Sarah's assets, and his criminal conviction made it impossible for him to contest the dissolution of their marriage. Sarah reclaimed her maiden name and, more importantly, her sense of self-worth. 6 months after Daniel's arrest, Sarah got a promotion at her old marketing firm, which welcomed her back with open arms once they learned the full story of what she had endured. She also started volunteering with a local organization that helped victims of domestic abuse, using her experience to help other women recognize and escape manipulative relationships. One evening, as we sat on my back porch watching the sunset and planning our long-delayed trip to Ireland, Sarah turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Dad, I need you to know something. Even when I was pushing you away, even when I was saying horrible things about you, being jealous or controlling, part of me always knew you were trying to protect me. I'm sorry it took me so long to listen." "You don't need to apologize for being manipulated by an expert," I said, putting my arm around her shoulders. "You survived something that destroys a lot of people. That takes incredible strength." "I learned that strength from you," she said simply. "From watching you never give up on me, even when I had given up on myself." We sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from orange to purple to deep blue. In the distance, I could hear the sound of Stephen's car pulling into the driveway, bringing takeout from our favorite Chinese restaurant for another family dinner. Daniel had tried to erase me from Sarah's life, to rewrite her history and reshape her future, according to his selfish desires. He had nearly succeeded, using sophisticated psychological manipulation and social pressure to isolate her from everyone who truly loved her. But he had made one fundamental miscalculation. He had assumed that love could be replaced with control, that genuine care could be substituted with manufactured dependency. He had never understood that real family bonds, the kind built on years of sacrifice and unconditional support, are not so easily severed. Sarah was safe now, stronger for having survived her ordeal, and wiser for having learned to recognize the difference between love and manipulation. Stephen and I had found our way back to each other, and our family had emerged from the crisis more united than we had been in years. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemy, but simply outlasting them. Daniel Morrison was serving 3 to 5 years in state prison, facing additional charges in 2 other states, and would likely spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder for the next victim brave enough to fight back. But I was sitting on my porch with my daughter, planning a trip to honor my late wife's memory and looking forward to many more years of Sunday dinners and family traditions. In the end, love had proven stronger than manipulation, truth had triumphed over lies, and family had overcome the forces that tried to tear it apart. That was the only victory that mattered.